Welcome to Our Town Live, where you'll hear the news and the views of our neighbors and friends. We're talking to Dr. Gibbs Williams, Ph.D., a renowned psychoanalyst practicing in New York for the last 50 years. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, you're exaggerating a bit. I am practicing for 47 years, not 50, which is okay. I hope to get to 50. I have an office about a block away from City Hall in New York City in an area of town called Tribeca.
Tell me a little bit about the type of practice. You say you're a psychoanalyst. What exactly is a psychoanalyst?
What exactly is a psychoanalyst? It's a very good question. What comes to my mind is that there is a book written that I think has to do with naming 365 different psychological theories, all of which lead to some kind of counseling, which means that 5 of them must have been invented last night because there's such an enormous amount of them. So that in deciding to be a psychoanalyst, or actually deciding to be a psychologist, if you were going to be totally objective, you would have to be thoroughly familiar with 365 different theories, which is absurd. So the question is, how did I pick psychoanalysis out of the 365? That was easy. My criteria for theory selection is, as everybody else does, clearly is based on one's basic sensibilities about such questions as the nature of reality, what's real, what isn't, what's pertinent information. Once you get the information, what do you do with it, and so forth. Making my choice easier is the fact that there are only 4 out of those 365 theories that have a psychoanalytic perspective. And a psychoanalytic perspective means that there is an assumption that there is a personal unconscious which motivates behavior. By personal unconscious, I mean that the key critical decisions that a person makes in their life, usually about love and work and meaning and hobbies and so forth, is all done instinctually. It's below the level of consciousness. And it's, in effect, what's equated with concepts like a gut feeling. In choosing psychoanalysis, I like the organizing concepts which seem to be most relevant in trying to understand what makes a person tick and excludes those things which seem to be absolutely irrelevant.
Now, let me interrupt just for a minute for 2 primary reasons. The first one is I have to tell people that are listening to us, especially for the first time, full disclosure. You are my brother, and you have been my brother for a very long time. That's the first disclosure. The second disclosure is to let people know that you were the impetus of writing a resource manual for first responders. The manual has to do with what we call attitude shifting. Now, when you and I first got together on this project, you were in New York, I was in Chicago, and finally, after 40 some odd years, we started to talk together on almost a regular basis. Up until then, for 40 years, we talked to one another maybe twice a year on each other's birthday. But because I had an issue and I didn't know who to turn to, I turned to my brother. What was my issue? My issue was I had just had a triple bypass, was scared to death, didn't know what to do, looked at my scar every day and got more scared, so I called you. Now, I'm saying all those things for another primary reason. We started to put this manual together, this book, and I started asking you questions. You started asking me questions, but the problem was every time I asked you a question and you gave me an answer, I had a hard time understanding it. So what we did for the next year is you gave me all kinds of information about myself, about living, about changing attitudes, shifting attitudes, and it was my job to take your language and put it into a language that hopefully most people could understand. It's been very successful. It's called attitude shifting. Now, with that said, and a very obvious plug, let me ask you a couple more questions about you. What do you think are your strengths when you're talking to you don't call them clients, your patients?
Good question. I think through the years, I've been able to be very sensitive to the vocabulary, the language, the styles of my individual patients, and I use my two major techniques to try to understand them. The first is talking, and it's not just talk, it's special talk, which tries to address their particular details. And the second technique is carefully listening to detail. So in that connection, then, I try to identify, as I said, the language and style of individual patients. And I think I'm pretty good at doing that. I'm very attuned to what preoccupies them, what's their interest, how they generate personal meanings, and so forth, so that I'm able to take a relatively complex material and break it down into a way of understanding what makes them tick.
Let me ask you another question on the other side. What do you think are your weaknesses when it comes to your practice and dealing with folks like me?
I've been working on this probably for the amount of time I'm alive, which is 82 years. Cultivating patience, tolerating differences, not jumping to conclusions. When I'm irritated about people not being where I would like them to be, instead of acting like a smartass, like I know exactly what's going on, I try to be, as I said, cultivate patience, tolerate frustration.
Let me ask you, where would you like them to be? That's an interesting statement.
I have no problem with differences, even major differences or difficulties. That's not an issue. I have had difficulties when I have been attuned to the fact that people often, that I'm aware of, often have a difficulty with themselves. And they often, in a way, interrupt themselves or find it difficult to be spontaneous. And I'm very sensitive to that, and I've tended to get irritated, and I'm much more patient with that now.
How well do you work under pressure? And what would be pressure for you in a typical day?
I'm great under pressure. When I first started being an analyst, I in a way, not really understanding this is what I was doing, but later realizing I was very good at crisis intervention. Example of crisis intervention. I worked at a place called Odyssey House many years ago, which is a pioneer therapeutic community for the treatment of heroin addicts. And there were crises go on all the time. And what we would have, the people who would come into the program were raw heroin addicts with rap sheets. They were, with everything on them. And they would have to come into the program and not take drugs for 6 months and then be part of this therapeutic community. And there was a crisis every other moment. Crises involved panic attacks. People were terribly depressed, threatened suicide, threatened murder. These kind of really major behavioral things.
How do you make important decisions?
How do I make important decisions? I have to first assess that what I am observing, either verbally or physically or behaviorally, is important. And by important, that implies crisis. It implies that it's sort of a soldier in battle, that you can get killed, with bullets flying around, and you got to survive. So that you have to be hyper alert to what's going on in practical reality. You have to duck. You have to keep calm and steady under pressure.
How do you relax when you get home?
My wife would say I don't, because at the moment I am addicted to the political scene, and I tune into everything that I can to be aware of it, and she thinks I'm out of my mind because I'm looking for stress. But the truth of it is, it calms me, and it makes me feel as if I'm in a college course in political science, so I actually love it.
What is absurd that you love doing? What is absurd? What is ridiculous to most people that you love to do?
Well, among my hobbies is constructing very intricate old classic ships, wooden, which consumes many hours and very tedious, and I love that. People might think I'm out of my mind for, messing with ropes and knots and glue and so forth. I love it. What else? Good question. Let me think about it.
What project would you consider your most significant career accomplishment up till today?
Early on, started keeping a journal that lasted 37 years as a result of my trying to order my chaos, having had what I consider a functional breakdown when I was a sophomore at college. And it was a quest. I kept it, and I've been revising it through the years. And it was really a quest for my identity and how I was, in effect, lost for decades and then began to find myself.
Another question. If you could get the biggest billboard in New York City, what would you put on it?
Good question. I think what I would do is to say, if you want some answers to some very difficult questions, read this. And the list certain papers, certain books that I've written and so forth.
Since we're running a little bit short on time, and we're going to do this again, I hope that you will do this with me, where can people get in touch with you if they have some issues that they'd like to talk about? You have a phone number, an address, office
Yes,
hours?
In New York City, my phone number is 914-473-7140.
Say it one more time. We want to make sure people understand it.
914-473-7140. If I'm busy, leave your name or contact information. I'll be sure to get in touch with you relatively shortly.
Do you have an email address?
Yeah, my email address is gwilliamsny11@aol.com. I also have a website that's quite interesting called gibbsonline.com.
Wonderful. And, of course, we want people to remember that you and I wrote a book, a reference manual for first responders. It's called Attitude Shifting, and you can read all about it and hear all about it at attitudeshifting.net. That's attitudeshifting.net. And we want to thank you for giving us some of your time, and hopefully we'll get back together again, okay?
Great.